In the summer of 1996, the company we now call WWE was dying. Not struggling, dying. A rival promotion, backed by a billionaire's fortune, was beating them in the ratings every single Monday night, week after week after week, for what would become 83 consecutive weeks. The product felt stale, aimed at children, hemorrhaging its biggest stars and its money. Insiders openly discussed the word bankruptcy. The most famous wrestling company in the world was circling the drain, and almost everyone in the industry expected it to lose. 3 years later, that same company went public on the stock market as a billion-dollar corporation, having crushed its rival so completely that it simply bought the carcass. The single most important reason for that impossible turnaround was a bald, goateed, beer-chugging, middle-finger-flipping redneck from a tiny town in Texas. A man who had been fired from that very rival promotion by a phone call because an executive decided he would never draw money. His name was Stone Cold Steve Austin, and the numbers he produced are staggering. His Austin 316 catchphrase became one of the best-selling T-shirts in the history of the planet. His feud with his on-screen boss is regularly called the single greatest rivalry professional wrestling has ever produced. He drove record television ratings, record pay-per-view buys, and record merchandise sales, and he did it all while the company bet its entire survival on his bald head. He was not the best technical wrestler. He was not the biggest or the flashiest. He just happened to be the exact right man, with the exact right attitude, at the exact moment a disillusioned country was desperate to watch someone flip off the boss. So how did a big drinking redneck who got fired over the phone become the man who saved a billion-dollar company? He was born Stephen James Williams on December 18, 1964, and he grew up in Edna, Texas, a small working-class town where nothing was handed to anybody. This is the soil the entire legend grows out of, because Steve Williams was, to his bones, an ordinary blue-collar Texan, the kind of man who knew the value of a hard day's work and a cold beer at the end of it. That authenticity, that complete lack of pretension would one day make him the most relatable superstar the business ever produced. But that was decades away. What he had first was toughness and size. He was a genuine athlete, a good enough football player to earn a scholarship to North Texas State University, where he played defensive end. He was big, strong, and hard-nosed, with the natural durability of a man built to absorb punishment. He was not, however, an obvious superstar in the making. He did not have a movie star face or a bodybuilder's physique, or a natural gift for the spotlight. He looked like exactly what he was, a tough, regular guy from a tough, regular place, in a business that had spent decades worshipping giants, glamour boys, and chiseled musclemen. Nobody looked at Steve Williams and saw the future. He was too normal. And that, though no one knew it yet, was going to be the most valuable quality a wrestler could possibly have. And here is a small but crucial detail about his name. When he broke into wrestling, his real name, Steve Williams, was already taken by another, more established wrestler, the legitimately fearsome Dr. Death Steve Williams, so he needed a new one. He became Steve Austin, and the irony is perfect, because the man from Edna would take a borrowed name and make it more famous than almost any real name in the history of the sport. The raw materials were all there, the toughness, the work ethic, the deep, genuine, blue-collar authenticity. What was missing was the spark, the attitude, the voice. And finding that voice would take years, a humiliating firing, and a cup of tea. For now, he was just a strong, anonymous Texan, paying his dues in the wrestling territories, with no idea that he was carrying the future of an entire industry around inside him. He trained under a wrestler named Chris Adams in Texas, and broke into the business in 1989. Before long, he landed in World Championship Wrestling, the very company backed by the billionaire's money, and there he became stunning Steve Austin, a long-haired, athletic, technically sound wrestler who was, by any honest measure, genuinely good. This is a part of the story most casual fans forget. Before the bald head and the beer, Steve Austin was a polished, skilled in-ring performer. He won the television championship and the United States championship. He formed a beloved tag team called the Hollywood Blondes with his friend Brian Pillman. He worked alongside the best minds in the business in a stable of villains and absorbed everything. He was a rising talent, a workhorse, a man clearly destined for bigger things. The only problem was that the people running the company could not see it. Then came the injury and the insult that changed everything. While on a tour of Japan in 1995, Austin tore his triceps. And while he was at home, hurt and recovering, unable to defend himself, an executive named Eric Bischoff fired him by phone, reportedly deciding that Austin was not marketable, that he would never draw money, that he simply did not have it. Imagine the fury of that. A talented, dedicated young wrestler cast aside over the telephone by a man who looked at him and saw nothing. That insult lit a fire in Steve Austin that would not go out for a decade, and it would, eventually, burn that entire company to the ground. He would spend the next several years quietly promising himself that the people who fired him would pay for it, and then he would spend a few years after that making good on the promise in the most public way imaginable. He took the rage to a small, violent cult promotion called Extreme Championship Wrestling, where a brilliant promoter named Paul Heyman did something no one else had done. He handed Austin a microphone and told him to be himself, to say what he really felt. And Austin, raw and furious, cut savage, hilarious, venomous promos tearing apart the company that had discarded him, naming names, mocking the executives who had written him off. For the first time, the real man came through. Not a gimmick, not a character, just an angry, brilliant, hilarious Texan with a score to settle. The voice was there all along. Someone had finally just let him use it. And once it was out, it was never going back in the box. In late 1995, the World Wrestling Federation signed him and promptly made the same mistake everyone else had. They gave him a terrible gimmick. They called him the ringmaster and saddled him with a manager who did his talking for him, burying the one thing that made Austin special: his voice. It flopped. It was, in Austin's own words, a bad gimmick, so he asked to reinvent himself, and the reinvention became wrestling folklore. As the story goes, his wife at the time made him a cup of tea and told him to drink it before it got stone cold. The phrase stuck. He shaved his head, grew a goatee, pulled on plain black trunks and a black vest, and became Stone Cold Steve Austin, a beer-swilling, foul-mouthed, authority-hating anti-hero who answered to no one. It was not really a character at all. It was just Steve Williams from Edna, Texas, with the volume turned all the way up. The world met the real Stone Cold at the King of the Ring tournament in June of 1996. After defeating the veteran Jake the Snake Roberts, who, at the time, was playing a born-again Christian, Austin grabbed the microphone and delivered the promo that launched everything. Mocking Roberts' religious gimmick and the famous Bible verse, he sneered the line that would change his life and the industry. Austin 3:16 says, "I just whipped your ass." The arena reacted. The phrase exploded. It showed up on handmade signs in every arena in the country and on those record-breaking t-shirts. A star had been born in a single sentence. What made it land was that it felt dangerous and real in a way wrestling had not felt in years. This was not a hero telling kids to say their prayers and eat their vitamins. This was a snarling, defiant adult telling the world he did not care what anyone thought of him. It was the perfect message at the perfect time, and it spread like wildfire across a fan base that had grown bored with cartoon heroes. Within months, Austin 3:16 was scrawled on poster board in arenas from coast to coast. A rallying cry for everyone who had ever wanted to stop being polite and start fighting back. A single promo had given a sinking company the first genuine spark it had felt in years. But here was the wall. Being a popular, edgy mid-card act in a sinking company is not the same as being a savior. Austin was over with the fans, yes, but he held no major championship. The company was still losing the war badly, and the question hanging over everything was brutal and simple. Could a beer-drinking brawler with a borrowed name and no title actually carry a dying billion-dollar business on his back? Nobody had ever asked one wrestler to do quite that much, and Austin was about to be asked. What turned Steve Austin from a hot catchphrase into a legend was a single match, and the most famous double cross in wrestling history, against the technical master Bret, the Hitman Hart. The two men had been feuding for months, the cocky, foul-mouthed Texan against the proud, by-the-book Canadian hero, and it all came to a head at WrestleMania 13 in March of 1997, in a submission match with the fearsome shoot fighter Ken Shamrock as the special referee. Austin was not the technical wizard Bret Hart was, and the story of the match leaned into that. It became a war of attrition, a brutal, bloody brawl, and late in the match, Hart locked Austin into his deadly sharpshooter submission hold. Now watch what happened, because it is one of the greatest moments the business has ever produced. Austin is trapped. Blood is pouring down his face from a cut on his forehead, a crimson mask streaming into his eyes. The hold is agonizing. Every instinct says to give up, to tap, to quit. And Steve Austin refuses. He will not submit. He screams in defiance. He tries to fight to the ropes, and finally, with the blood running and the pain unbearable, he passes out cold rather than say the word quit. He loses the match. And in losing it, refusing to surrender even into unconsciousness, he becomes the toughest, most beloved anti-hero in all of wrestling. It was a perfect double turn. The villainous Austin, by sheer guts, became the hero the crowd adored. The heroic Bret Hart, by attacking the helpless Austin after the bell, became the man they hated. And the timing could not have been more perfect, because the audience of the late 1990s did not want a squeaky clean cartoon superhero anymore. They were cynical. They were tired of being told what to do. They wanted a beer-drinking, boss-defying everyman who fought authority and refused to quit. This is the thing the people running the business had failed, for years, to understand. The culture had shifted. The wholesome, flag-waving heroism of the 1980s had curdled into something more skeptical and harder-edged. Audiences had grown up, gotten jobs, gotten bosses, gotten bills, and they no longer wanted to be told to do the right thing. They wanted to watch someone do the satisfying thing, the rebellious thing, the thing they could not do in their own lives without getting fired. Austin was not a role model, and that was exactly the point. He was a release valve. He was every frustration the working audience carried around all week, given a bald head, a leather vest, and a finishing move. Steve Austin had just shown them exactly who that man was. Now he needed the perfect enemy to fight, and the perfect enemy was the man who signed his paychecks. To understand how Steve Austin saved the company, you first have to understand just how close to dead it really was, because the comeback only means something against the scale of the catastrophe. The enemy was World Championship Wrestling, and it was a monster. Bankrolled by the media billionaire Ted Turner's deep pockets, it had poached the biggest stars in the business and built the hottest storyline in wrestling around a gang of invaders called the New World Order. Its Monday night show beat the World Wrestling Federation's show in the head-to-head ratings war for 83 straight weeks, an almost unimaginable streak of total domination. The WWF was bleeding talent, bleeding money, and staring directly at the possibility of going out of business entirely. This was not a fair fight. One company had a billionaire and all the momentum. The other had a sinking ship and a bald guy from Texas. Understand how hopeless it looked from the inside. The rival could simply throw money at any star it wanted, signing away legends the WWF had spent years building. Its show was slick, its roster was stacked, and its lead announcer would brag accurately that they had beaten the WWF for week after week after week. Smart people in the industry openly predicted the WWF would not survive. The history of professional wrestling looked like it was about to end with one company standing and the other in a grave. And the man the WF was about to bet its entire existence on had no world title, a borrowed name, and a reputation in the rival's eyes as a guy who could not draw a dime. So the WWF gambled everything on attitude, on getting edgier, meaner, and more adult than its squeaky clean rival, and at the center of that gamble was the greatest storyline wrestling has ever told. Stone Cold Steve Austin versus his evil boss, Mr. McMahon. Think about the genius of it. Every single person watching had a boss. Every person had, at some point, dreamed of telling that boss exactly where to shove it. And here, every week, was a working-class everyman in a beat-up vest, doing precisely that, to the richest, most arrogant, most punchable corporate tyrant imaginable. The blue-collared hero against the white-collar villain. It was the most relatable conflict in the world, and the audience lost their minds for it. McMahon would scheme and abuse his authority, stack the odds, hire monsters to destroy his own employee, and every single time, somehow, the rattlesnake would find a way to drop him on his head and crack open a beer over his unconscious body. Picture the scene that played out 100 different ways. Mr. McMahon struts to the ring in his $1,000 suit, sneering, abusing his power, trying to crush the rebellious employee. And Austin comes charging down the aisle to that shattering glass sound, flips off the entire arena with both hands, climbs in, and drops the billionaire on his head with the stone-cold stunner while 18,000 people erupt, as if their own bosses had just been knocked out cold. Then he stands over him, calls for a beer, and drinks it while the crowd chants his name. He drove a beer truck to the ring and hosed McMahon down with it. He filled the ring with the sound of breaking glass and the roar of people who had finally found a hero who fought the same fights they did. And it worked. On April 13th, 1998, with a one-on-one confrontation between Austin and McMahon as the centerpiece, the WWF's Monday show finally beat the rival show in the ratings, snapping that 83-week losing streak. The tide did not just turn, it permanently reversed. Weeks earlier, at WrestleMania 14, Austin had defeated Shawn Michaels, with boxing legend Mike Tyson in his corner as the special enforcer, to win his first world championship and signal the changing of the guard. From that moment, the WWF surged, and the rival company, clinging to its stale storylines and aging stars, began to collapse. The numbers tell the rest. Austin's merchandise sold like nothing the business had ever seen. Television ratings soared, pay-per-view records shattered, and in October of 1999, the World Wrestling Federation went public on the stock market, transformed from a near-bankrupt operation into a publicly traded billion-dollar corporation. 2 years after that, the rival that had once dominated it for 83 straight weeks was dead, bought out and absorbed. The war was over. The beer-drinking redneck had won it. A man fired over the telephone for being unmarketable had become the single biggest draw in the history of the company, and the engine that powered it from the edge of the grave to the top of the entire industry. Slow down here, because the man partying with beer trucks and flipping off the world was, the entire time, fighting a private war against his own broken body. Go back to SummerSlam in 1997, right as his rise was beginning. In a match against Owen Hart, Austin took a piledriver, a move where he was lifted upside down and driven headfirst toward the mat. It went wrong. He was dropped directly onto the crown of his head, and his neck fractured. For several terrifying moments, Steve Austin lay in the middle of the ring, temporarily unable to move his arms or his legs. He was briefly paralyzed, and then, barely aware of his surroundings, running on pure instinct, he managed to roll his opponent into a small package and finish the match, before walking to the back under his own power, his body screaming. The damage was permanent, and here is the gut punch. Steve Austin carried the entire boom period, the greatest comeback in wrestling history, the merchandise records, the ratings war, all of it, on a broken-down neck that never fully healed. He wrestled his entire peak in chronic pain, knowing that every single bump, every stunner, every brawl was grinding down a spine that doctors warned him about constantly. He changed his whole style because of it, becoming more of a brawler than the smooth technician he had once been in WCW, trading the athletic, technical wrestler from his early days for a slower, harder, more grounded fighter, because that was all his neck would allow. Think about the cruelty of the timing. At the exact moment he became the most valuable performer in the world, the moment the entire company was leaning its full weight on him, his body was already failing. He could have eased off. He could have protected himself, taken nights off, demanded a lighter schedule. He did the opposite. He kept going, full speed, night after night, because the company needed its champion and the fans needed their hero. And Steve Austin was not built to do anything halfway. The man who looked on television like the toughest, most invincible party animal alive was in reality a man holding his own career together with willpower and pain, sacrificing his long-term health, year after year, to keep the company he had saved on top. The beer was real, so was the agony underneath it. By the early 2000s, the war was won, and a war hero without a war is a difficult thing. In 2001, in one of the most controversial decisions of his career, Austin turned villain and aligned himself with his old enemy, Mr. McMahon. The problem was that the rebellion was over. The entire point of Stone Cold had been fighting the boss, and joining him drained the magic. The fans, who had loved him for defiance, did not know what to do with a Stone Cold who had sold out. It never fully worked. Then came the breaking point. In 2002, frustrated with the creative direction and the way he was being booked, Steve Austin simply walked out of the company, leaving the business for a time amid real bitterness. It was a hard, complicated chapter for a man who had given the company everything, including his health. And his body, in the end, made the final decision for him. The neck that had been broken in 1997 could not take any more. At WrestleMania 19 in 2003, Steve Austin wrestled what would be his final match against The Rock, the other great megastar of the era. He lost, and afterward, the man who had saved a billion-dollar company walked away from the ring for good. His in-ring career ended at just 38 by the injuries he had absorbed carrying everyone else. In 2009, he was inducted into the Hall of Fame. And nearly 2 decades later, at WrestleMania in 2022, at the age of 57, he climbed through the ropes one last time for a single, electrifying one-off match, drank his beers in the middle of the ring, and reminded an entire new generation, for one night, exactly what they had missed. The pop when that glass shattered and the music hit, all those years later, told the whole story. He had been gone for nearly 20 years. And the building still came apart at the seams the instant they heard him coming. Some stars fade the moment they stop. Stone Cold Steve Austin never faded at all. He just waited, and the love was still there, exactly as loud as the day he left. Strip away the beer, and the broken glass, and the middle fingers, and look at what actually happened here. A tough, ordinary kid from Edna, Texas, with a borrowed name and a body built to take punishment, paid his dues for years, got dismissed as unmarketable, and fired over the telephone by people who looked at him and saw nothing. And instead of breaking him, that rejection forged him. He found his real voice, turned his genuine blue-collar self up to maximum volume, and arrived at the precise historical moment where a cynical, overworked, authority-weary audience was desperate for exactly what he was. Not a perfect hero, but a defiant, beer-drinking everyman who fought the boss, refused to quit, and answered to nobody. He did not become a star by pretending to be something extraordinary. He became the biggest star in the world by being the most relatable ordinary man who ever lived. And in doing it, he saved a company. That is not hype. The World Wrestling Federation was genuinely close to dying, losing a war it could not seem to win. And Steve Austin, more than any other single performer, dragged it off the floor and carried it to victory and to a billion-dollar fortune. He gave a generation of working people a hero who fought their fight, who flipped off the same bosses they wanted to flip off, who took a beating and got back up every single time. He turned being a regular guy into the most electrifying act in the business. The kid nobody believed in became the man who beat everybody. And he did it without ever pretending to be anything other than himself. So where does he actually rank? And you have to be honest, because the honest case for Steve Austin has both towering strengths and real blemishes. If the question is who was the most technically gifted, the most well-rounded in-ring artist, Austin is not the answer. He was a fine wrestler, genuinely skilled in his WCW days, but after the neck injury, he was primarily a brawler, not a Ric Flair or a Bret Hart in pure craft. His peak, because of that broken neck, was relatively short. A handful of blazing years rather than the decades some legends managed. The villain turn in 2001 is widely considered a misfire, and his abrupt walkout in 2002 left a sour taste. And any honest accounting must include the dark chapter of 2002, when Austin pleaded no contest to a charge of assaulting his then-wife, a serious and troubling episode that sits uncomfortably alongside the cheering crowds. A complete picture does not airbrush that away. But change the question to impact, to drawing power, to sheer cultural force, and Austin's case becomes overwhelming. At his absolute peak, Stone Cold Steve Austin was very likely the single hottest, biggest drawing attraction professional wrestling has ever produced, outselling and outrating everyone. His merchandise a phenomenon, his catchphrase a part of the wider culture. Hulk Hogan took the business mainstream in the 1980s, and his peak fame may have been broader. The Rock became a bigger crossover movie star. Ric Flair was the superior pure wrestler, but not one of them can claim what Austin can, that he, more than anyone, won the war that decided the fate of the entire industry and carried a dying company to a billion-dollar triumph. So how good was he actually? As a technician, very good, never the best, and cut short by his neck. As a man, flawed, with a real and serious blemish on his record. But as a drawing card, as a cultural lightning rod, as the right man at the exact right moment, he may stand at the very top. The honest verdict fits a man who turned being ordinary into being unstoppable. Steve Austin was not the most skilled wrestler who ever lived, and his story is not without its shadows. But when a billion-dollar company needed one person to save it, the man who answered the call was a bald, beer-drinking redneck from Edna, Texas. And he did not just answer it. He won. A tough kid from a small Texas town, fired over the phone for being unmarketable, became the most electrifying everyman in the history of the business, and dragged a dying company back from the grave, on the strength of a beer and a raised middle finger. But standing across the ring from him in that final match, and in a dozen of the biggest matches of the entire boom, was a different kind of superstar entirely. A third-generation wrestler with $1 million smile and a tongue quicker than anyone the business had ever heard. A man who would leave wrestling behind to become the single biggest movie star on the planet. Next time, we tell the story of The Rock, the grandson of a Samoan legend who became the most electrifying man in all of entertainment, and then the single biggest movie star on the planet.